Hear ye! The podcast commencing forthwith doth contain time travel agents, evil eyes, and genuine body positivity as we explore private part pins in this Renfestuary series finale episode here on Created Things.
Greetings. Shalom, good evening. Welcome to Created Things, the only podcast that has the courage to follow the Pilgrim trail wherever it might lead. I'm Dominican priest, medievalist, Father Gabriel Toretta. With me is my co-host, Jacob Flores Popchick, artist, psychotherapist. I want to know how you're doing, Jacob, but before I ask, I'm just going to tell, gentle listener, if you happen to have a gentle listener with you who is under 18, tell them that you forgot that there's something in the oven. Turn it off. Turn off the podcast. Go throw your phone into the garbage. Pretend you've never listened to this podcast and then come back and listen to it on your own. But I'm just going to tell you right now.
There's this motif in Renaissance festivals. Of course, we're celebrating Renfestuary right now.
Yeah.
And this is actually our grand finale to Renfestuary.
Which, honestly, I'm going to say right now, it could neither be grander nor finale-er. So
it might be the finale of the whole podcast. Period,
yeah, this is what happens when you go real big into Renfestuary. So you were saying.
Right, but at actual Renfests, you will often see performances that are quite bawdy in their humor, and there's a joke you will hear repeated by different acts where they say, "Now, kids, if you're in the audience right now watching this, we have something to tell you. You have bad parents."
Yeah, that's how this is. That's how this is.
So that's this announcement for you guys. Don't listen to this with your kids unless your kids are cool as hell.
Yeah, actually, you know what? No, just don't ever, because I don't want to have to report this to the authorities. Like, just sure, don't.
Fair enough.
Yeah, that's right.
You're covering our little butts legally, I guess, which I appreciate.
Just don't even.
That's your job.
Yeah, that's what I do. That's yeah. This is what we do now. That's right. We protect ourselves legally. So, so with that very natural and totally organic announcement, which is the kind of thing that we make every time we start this lighthearted, fun, nothing to do with, trigger warning and possibly adult content material podcast, we ask ourselves, how are you doing? And how are you doing?
I'm doing well. For those watching the video version of this podcast on Spotify and YouTube now, I decided for the finale to pull out one of several Renaissance Festival shirts that I have. So this is the one that has the most lacing on the front.
Yeah, I would say
translates best on camera.
Yeah, normally I would encourage people to watch our episodes on Spotify or YouTube. This one, perhaps, I'm just going to give you another warning, which is that did you know that the more Renaissance-y a shirt is, the more man cleavage it has.
Much man cleavage.
This is a thing, So you might think, oh, I'm familiar with what cleavage looks like. Well, mostly that's on ladies. But
yeah, I know.
Always.
And I personally, as a feminist myself, I think it's important that we have equality, and so I think it's high time women stop being the ones who get the majority share on cleavage. And then we need to bring back the floofy. Isn't there like a whole Seinfeld episode where he wears a pirate shirt? I think we need to bring back the Seinfeld pirate shirt.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, yes, anything to do with the pirate shirt, I'm all about. This is pretty great.
Yeah.
So listen, I'm going to tell you, they're right pretty much when we started this podcast, when we were still thinking about all kinds of things, and it was sort of we had really
in
big
the beginning.
Yeah, we had really big topics.
Was without form.
Well, yeah, exactly. When the spirit was hovering over totem vabohu, or whatever it is in Hebrew.
Tohu wabohu.
Yeah, like I said, We were doing episodes, like I looked back at our first episode the other day, and it has like several topics, each one of which is gigantic, and it's like, what the heck were we thinking? Anyway, among these, like, so we were thinking in some of those directions, like these like gigantic podcasts, but then we were also thinking in some really, really, really super niche ones, which of course is where we ended up mostly going. And you, from the very, very beginning or very early on, were like, there is something I want to do an episode on.
Yes.
And you sent me a link, and I was like, I don't know. How do I put it? Not to put too fine a point on it. What the hell am I looking at? And today, my friends, is the day where we ask ourselves, what the hell am I looking at?
Yeah. Especially if you're watching the video version of the podcast. If you're listening, then you're going to say, what the hell am I hearing? Because today, not to jump into it too quickly, but why I was about to say beat around the bush, but I can't say that. Why waste time here? We're talking about medieval genital pins.
We are.
And before I even explain what that means, I have to say I've been so excited for this episode all week. And you know that thing when maybe you don't have this, but like where you get excited for something or you like think about something and it triggers a song in your memory, and then suddenly that song gets stuck in your head for a long period of time. So for some reason, my brain has been singing from Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cats, the Jellicle Cats song, but with genital pins replaced as the lyric all week. I'm like, genital pins and genital pins, genital pins and genital pins. So I've been very excited about this episode.
I can see. I was kind of dreading it because like the only way you introduced
that's your whole personality.
Yeah, basically. Was the only thing you introduced to me as was like, there are these medieval pilgrimage genital pins. And then you showed me a couple of pictures of them and I was like, what in the actual poo is this, you know? And I was like, but I don't know how does one research this? You know, I can't just go to the library and be like, medieval pilgrimage genital pins.
It's funny you say that because that's exactly what I did.
Yeah, but you know, like, gentle listener, let me like spill the beans on like my research method here. I literally went into Google and I typed medieval pilgrimage genital badges. I think I might have said.
Yeah, I think badges is actually the right term.
It's actually the proper term, but whatever. And then I discovered tracked things down to like actually scholarly sources and things because that's my jam. But no, it's super exciting. I'm just gonna let me just set the stage real quick before we talk about the whole context.
Set the stage for the two listeners we haven't already alienated.
Yeah, exactly. And then the one that we're about to alienate. No. So there's this cool thing when you're looking at things in the past where like you don't like the thing itself is the only record that it ever existed.
Yes,
people can kind of call this like considered broadly as a field of study. This is broadly what people will call like material culture, which is something I'm really interested in, and it's become sort of fashionable in the last while, which is like, you know, even as historians, we're very often used to like, we can sort of get obsessed with texts, you know, with like books and things that are written down because like we can read them and they tell us what they say and these kinds of things. And so, and then like, if you think visual art can already kind of get short shrift there because it doesn't always tell you what it means. But even so, like, people have gotten pretty used to reading visual imagery as like a historical source or a theological source, or there's all kinds of things. But there's other kinds of just like physical material artifacts that that never really get mentioned or rarely get mentioned in any extant written sources. So people are not talking about them in ways that survive. And so all you have is the thing itself. And so you have to kind of contextualize it and understand it from what you know of the culture broadly, and then like you put it into like bigger rings of understanding, rings of genres and things like that. But ultimately, you're really like, to some level, you're left with the thing itself.
Yeah, it's these big historical mysteries. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, my inference from a lot of these different things, not just the ones we're talking about today, but like this phenomena that you're describing, is that oftentimes the conclusion, therefore, is that this object was so ubiquitous and so commonplace that no one really thought it was important or relevant to write down, because why would I talk about this thing that's that ubiquitous? So when you find an object that isn't documented that way in this manner that you're describing, it actually says something about the culture pretty profoundly, because no one thought it was rare enough to write about.
Yeah, and that it's not 100% always that case, because sometimes it's just maybe used by poorer people who weren't writing, or they were just not intersecting with the groups of people who were writing things down at the time, or there can be some, or just stuff didn't survive. So there can be various reasons for it, but that is it's a helpful thought, and it is definitely relevant in the particular. It's a tool that's very often useful for unpacking a little bit of meaning, and I think that's helpful for us today. In fact, so before we get to the thing itself, just one sort of ring of context in which to put it in is that people we're going to focus really today on like the 14th and the 15th century. And it's not unique to this time period, but people in the 14th and the 15th century were exactly as excited as anybody else is and was in history to wear like little pieces of flair in the Office Space term, so like when I was in high school and stuff, it was like all of the cool kind of edgy kids. This was still the time period when like all the kind of edgy kids would wear these like buttons, or have buttons on their backpacks, or mostly buttons on their backpacks and stuff, with kind of like edgy alternative slogans, or like edgy bands nobody ever heard of, or like these kinds of things. Or like
the Happy Bunny buttons from Hot Topic and all that kind of thing.
Anything ever sold. Like think of course the Hot Topic jam. During the pandemic, somebody who really misunderstood my internal response to the pandemic sent me as a care package a packet that included a set of like buttons telling people to stay 6 feet away from me and things like this. So they're still around, like these kinds of things are still around. But anyway, so they were just a big jam, and like you would use them for all kinds of different things. And they represent, we know that they were found in every level of culture. So like the highest to the lowest, they're super duper common. They're made basically of cheap pewter, which is tin mixed with lead, and they're made from molds. So they're not individually carved or sculpted or anything. Like you just make a cheap mold real quick, and then you pour the cheapest of metals into it. And then bam, literally 10 seconds later, you have something that you can sell for a very small amount of money. And they're used everywhere. People just wear them around. So we do have like this artistic evidence of like people painted or drawn people who have like pilgrim badges, or badges on their hats, badges on their shirts, just like you would think people wearing buttons. And
I want to throw in here that there is something. Like, yes, there's something stylistic and aesthetic to I'm wearing all these badges like flair, but specifically, I mean, you're jumping into the pilgrim thing. And I think it's important to note that when a medieval person is going on a pilgrimage, which of course is a journey to visit some kind of holy site, to pay your respects there, or to offer prayer or supplication there, you're often making it almost sort of a spiritual bar crawl, as it were, where you're going to stop at several consecutively holier sites on the way. So like the Camino de Santiago in Spain, you're walking to this final holy spot, but you're stopping at many smaller holy spots along the way. And so to sort of mark your journey and for yourself as kind of a souvenir, and also to other pilgrims along the way to show how many sites you visited, you're going to get like a pewter one of these badges or pins symbolically at every stop that you make. So you get to the end of the road and you have the full set. So there's like a collect them all kind of element to this too, beyond just the aesthetics, which I think is important to note.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so you add on to that like pilgrimages were a really, 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 really big deal. Both local and like in rings expanding out, so going as far away as like I'm in Poland and I walk to Santiago at the end of Spain, which is a thing that people would do. Or, I just go, I walk for the afternoon to a local place, and then I walk back or something like that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So now not all of the badges that we have are definitively like pilgrim associated, but certainly a lot of them are. And like pilgrim people going on pilgrimage or coming back from pilgrimage is like one of the major sort of like cultural places where we have other surviving evidence that that's how people wore them, or like it was a major impetus for people acquiring them and then wearing them. But like, here's what's super cool. Why this is what's exciting about like studying material culture. We have extant about 20,000 of these badges just from Western Europe.
It's a huge, huge number of these things.
20,000. And I'm going to tell anybody right now who might be interested, go to Kunera.nl. That's Kunera.nl. It's a Dutch website, but it's also available in English. It's the scholarly database for all of these. So you can look at the approximately more than 20,000 badges that have been found, and you can see all of them, which is absolutely amazing. Because we know that like people from like the wealthiest people to the poorest people from like all over use these things. It gives you a really good sense of like what people found important. I mean, it would be a little bit like if you found, like 500 years from now, if you found 20,000 toothbrushes, it would be worth categorizing and like showing off these 20,000 toothbrushes because everyone is using them, from the richest people to the poorest people. And there are variations, but they're at the same time, they're cheap and they're commonly made. And it's this kind of thing.
That's a very good comparison, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But let me be clear that the ones that we want to talk about today are not just badges in general or pilgrim badges in general. We want to talk about a specific set of these, which it just so happens all that we can sort of identify and date seem to date between about 1375 and 1425. So it's a pretty small, very small time period given the wide expanse of these images and their use and stuff like this. Okay. Let me take the liberty to introduce one. Unless there's something else you want to say first.
Sure. Well, no, what I want to say is that because I think precisely for the reason that you mentioned, that we tend to go very niche, I think a listener could be forgiven for assuming that the sort of what we're loosely calling the genital pin subcategory of these pilgrim badges that we're about to explore are like a much more niche subcategory of this already niche thing. But I want to point out that that's really not true. That yes, you do find some from what we would in like a modern lens consider more traditional religious imagery. So you'll see little crosses, or like on the aforementioned Camino de Santiago, like if you complete that, you might get a little shell to represent baptism right at the end. But actually, it seems like the lion's share of these are using some very provocative genital imagery, like a huge number. And so I just wanted to kind of say that before we went in here, because I don't want to make it sound like, oh, there are 20,000 of these badges and like 3 of them are weird and we're talking about them today.
Oh,
like,
right.
A huge number of these things are what we're talking about today. And it does actually say something really fundamental about art history, Catholic history, the medieval imagination, like the Catholic and artistic perspective on the world, like all those things that you and I are concerned with. I think this topic sort of is the apex of it. And especially with Renfestuary, we've sort of been going deeper and deeper consecutively down the rabbit hole on our own little pilgrimage into weirdness, where we started kind of more broadly with Bardcore, with Hildegard von Blingen. And by the way, can we just have like a quick shout out for the amazing cover of our theme song that she did? Our original theme song recorded by a good friend of mine, an amazing musician from Mexico, Federico Carranza, but then she came in and did a Bardcore cover of it. So we started kind of very broad with her, and then we went in a little bit last week more narrowly with this Heart-Shaped Books thing, exploring like the juxtaposition of romantic love and divine love and all those kinds of things. And now we're sort of not just at the apex of those topics, but I think the apex of a lot of what we talk about in this program, because again, not to bury the lead, what we're about to talk about here is incredibly ubiquitous in this category of Pilgrim Badge.
Yeah, totally. And I'd say the only qualification I put on that is that, like, because you're right, like
the only way you'd qualify my qualification.
Yes, exactly. I think no, actually, I think that's an important point to make, and I'm glad you did. There's this interesting medievalist whose ideas actually inform a lot of the kind of historians' understandings of these images. Who at one point she's describing sort of female articulated medieval representations of Christ, or male articulated representations of Mary in various ways. And she says, like, at the beginning of an article, she says, like, listen, this is not what does she call it? Something like historical prurience. There's like a real reason I'm looking at these things, and I want to do this. You know, it's like basically like we're going to put on our big boy pants.
We're not just being trolls.
Yeah, and it's going to be awesome.
Not just being trolls. This matters. So anyway, with that said,
yeah, exactly. And then the one thing I'd say is that I would say, from what I've seen, it's not the lion's share, but it's not an inconsiderable number. So if you go to the suite Kunera database of all of these, you can search by tabs and categories and things, and search by the category sexuality, which is the one that's going to have all these. And it's got a lot. I mean, it's got a lot. I'd say it's, I need to look through and see, but it's in the order of a couple hundred or so. So it's a smaller genre within the whole set, you know, but that's just because we're talking about everything that exists. I mean, it's like
sure.
It's like if you're talking about
but
buttons,
it's by no means rare.
No, that's right.
I would
that's exactly right. I'd say it's like if you're thinking about the buttons that like edgy kids wore in high school, like anarchy buttons were probably, generally speaking, about 1 in 50 or 1 in 75, but they were very prominent, you know, like you notice them. They were very prominent. And I think these like genital pins were probably something relatively similar.
Superb comparison. Anyway, please, the floor is yours.
So yeah. Okay. So what are we actually talking about? Okay. So imagine, here's one type, for the record, possibly my favorite type, but okay.
Yes. Let's imagine Billy the Peasant.
Yes.
Billy the Peasant is walking down the road. You see him. It's a little dirt road. You smell the horse dung. You hear the birds singing. And he's got his little peasanty hat on. And as you're getting close, you see him.
You see this.
What is he wearing, Father Gabriel?
Yeah. So you look, and this is very striking pin or badge attached to his hat. And it's got a standing figure. It's relatively small. It's maybe a couple inches tall, but it's a standing figure with bare legs that are actually clearly articulated, surprisingly well and fairly detailed. On the feet, there are these really distinctly articulated and really clearly made wooden sandals. Pilgrims would wear these, not always, but pilgrims would wear these. It's just a flat piece of wood where your feet go, and then they have 2 vertical slats, slats of wood that you actually walk on. They're kind of like mini stilts, basically, and that's exactly the point. They were used in Japan as well, actually, but they're used all over the place. It's just that, like, if you're in a place where there's a lot of, like, say, mud, that might also be, say, excrement, you have like little mini stilts that you walk on when you can do a lot of walking. So it's like really well articulated. This is a pilgrim, you know, it's got these little pilgrim shoes on. The arms on the figure are short, but they're distinctly present. figures holding a staff in one hand and very clearly a rosary in the other. The whole is crowned with a pilgrim hat itself, and the pilgrim hat itself is clearly marked with a bunch of badges.
Very meta to have your badge wearing badges.
No, it's super meta. There's I'm going to put a finger on that one because it's going to get more meta. But
awesome.
So there are two things I would say that might catch your attention most about this little pilgrim badge. One is that the pilgrim staff that the little badge is carrying is topped with a phallus complete with testicles. That's also extremely well articulated and like pretty well designed. And then second, the figure itself doesn't have a head because excepting the arms and the legs and feet and hands, the whole body of the pilgrim on the badge is one giant vulva with arms and legs.
End of episode.
Goodbye, everyone. Done, and I am done. That's it. I am done forever.
Like honestly, the best way I can sort of describe this for those who cannot actually see it is sort of like, I feel like there are a lot of modern mascot characters like this, like do you remember Time for Timer, the old like PSA? He was like a little timer with arms and legs that would walk out and tell you to like take a snack break on like government sponsored PSAs, or
that's amazing.
or even like Miss Minutes from the Disney Plus show Loki, who's like a mid-century modern mascot character, and she's like a clock with little arms and legs that dances around. Like that's this. Like it's a little vulva with little stick arms and legs and a phallic cane and a little pilgrim hat
and a rosary.
Right.
You know?
And it's a vulva, so I'm going to say, and her own set of pins upon her hat.
Yes.
And Billy the Peasant is wearing this
just
on
wearing
his
it.
hat as he walks down the road wearing his little Japanese stilt flip-flops.
Yeah. And in case you thought, wow, boy, that is just to underscore the point that Jacob made earlier, like in case you thought, boy, that is weird, but you know, there's a lot of weird one-off things in the history of the universe, and this one just happened to have survived.
Maybe this is just a weird, crazy guy.
Maybe just one weird, crazy dude. So by my own looking through this database of the 20,000 pilgrim badges, or, you know, badges and medieval badges in general, I found 6 different versions of this. Now, when I say versions of this, now I said at the beginning that these are molds, you know, like molds from cheap made molds poured with pewter, you know. And so none of these is ever going to be, it's never an unicum, you know, like a singular object, like made once and then never made again. These are mass production, reproduction objects from their very nature. So whenever you see one, it means that there was 100, 1,000, 10,000.
Yes.
There were a lot more.
Yeah.
And the thing
there's no shiny Pokemon in these sets. These
exactly.
are all
they're
standard
all
issue.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. Commons, you know, they cost 10 cents, etc.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And I found 6 different versions of these that are very clearly different artists, different molds. I would suggest probably even different locations. They're totally different. The basic design is recognizable. It's all the
still
variations
the vulva
on
with the pilgrim hat. And
I'm just gonna say, like, once you tell me like vulva with a pilgrim hat, like the theme here is going to be pretty recognizable.
You can spot it in a criminal lineup.
I can say like, well, one of you is not like the other. I can't explain why. But one of you is not like the other.
Worst episode of Sesame Street.
Literally ever. Yeah. Everyone on it got canceled. It was incredible. Yeah. They all went to prison. But and then also there's this amazing, so there is a fair amount of scholarship on these actually, which is really great. And one of the scholars that I was reading on this actually points out that there are at least 10 different versions of this known.
Wow.
Now, again, we're recognizing these are mass-produced objects, so just looking for the ones that we extant have in 2023, I don't know, probably at least 10,000 of these made, probably more. But my favorite variation on it. So Jacob, you talked about how this was like very meta because your pilgrim badge is wearing a pilgrim hat with the pilgrim badges on it. The most meta variations are that the vulva pilgrim hat also has penis badges on it.
Incredible.
Which is so meta, I can't even handle it. Yeah, those were not as artistically well done, though. This is the one I just described as actually. I know, shocking. The one I just described is like the most surprisingly, like from a technical perspective, it's the most well done, and so it was the one that I found most interesting. But yeah,
not the one I found most interesting though, because as we say goodbye to Billy the peasant walking away, and we wonder to ourselves as we hobble on our own set of Japanese wooden flip-flops, we go, maybe that was just like the town pervert.
Yeah, what a creepazoid.
But then we see Maywin the peasant walking down the street, and Maywin has a different pin. This pin also features a vulva wearing an anthropomorphized vulva wearing human clothes and a little human hat. In this case, in some cases, a little crown might be used. But this, if you've ever seen sort of movies set in the Middle Ages or ancient Rome or anything, you might see like a queen or a king being carried on, by a bunch of servants. They'll be sitting on sort of an elevated platform with sticks coming out of it, and that the servants wear on their shoulders, and they go hop, 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 carry them around, right? Well, the servants in this case carrying around the queen vulva are themselves little anthropomorphic penises with arms and legs. And as you look at Maywin the peasant walking past with this, frankly, fever dream of a badge, you realize that Billy the peasant wasn't the town pervert. Actually, these two people are part of a long trend of people all wearing pins like this. They're all extremely devout. They don't mean it ironically. They don't mean it in a sophomoric kind of churlish way. They are all on their way to specific holy sites, or in many cases on the way home from specific holy sites. And this was their main souvenir from that experience. And now you have to question everything you know about your life.
Yeah. Or, or you're talking to medieval Stacy the peasant and peasantess, and she's just going on and on and on about like what an amazing time she had at whatever, this Marian shrine in the southern
she's
lowlands.
showing you all her Instagram photos. She's like, oh my God, you have to go.
Which are like, all of these badges that she's got of like the crucifixion and Mary holding the Christ child, and then like the Sacred Heart. Well, it's not gonna be the Sacred Heart yet, but various images, devotional images, and these kinds of things. Maybe it'll be an image of the saint whose shrine she went to. And then you notice among them that there's like an image of there's a lady who appears to be sort of straddling a broom, kind of like witch-like, and then she has a purse hanging out her back pocket with a penis in it,
as one does. And
she's just like, oh yeah, I got that there too.
And then she shows you this, the photos on Instagram of this guy that she met at the holy site, and he's got some pins of both penises and vulvas with angel halos and little angel wings, and they're flitting about like some kind of Monty Python cartoon. And you actually find out that maybe was the most popular one of all of them, actually. And again, your brain's spinning. You question everything about your life.
I just really did not think. When I took the time travel machine back to the Middle Ages, I was just not. Nobody prepared me for this.
Yeah. Yeah, the time travel agent did not satisfactorily
did not
like, pump me up for this beforehand.
Yeah, in fact, I guess we're allowed to mention it at this point, but in fact, we are officially being sponsored by the future, because we're giving we're actually giving important, these are future government sponsored PSAs for time travelers to the Middle Ages. So things you shouldn't be surprised by. For instance, when you see your pious pilgrim walking back from Compostela, covered in penises.
The future. Are you getting tired of the present? Try the past.
The past.
The future.
So there's like, I want to like break into kind of thinking and analyzing these things here in just a second, but like, I'm going to say something here that is true, and we're just going to leave it at that. Almost all of these have been found in what's now the Netherlands. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, I don't know why.
Well, almost all of them, I will say, like a handful have, like a minority handful have been found in London.
Yeah, there's a few in London. So the British Museum has a handful. You can see some more on the British Museum website if you go there. By the way,
and then France, I would say, probably seems to have the second largest amount behind the Netherlands. So it sort of goes like but I think that's important to note, because this isn't just like one given culture, right? Like this is kind of ubiquitous among European medievals, Catholic medievals throughout this period. I mean, it's definitely more popular in the Netherlands and France and London, but just the fact that that's at least three, and realistically, if you're looking at medieval language splits, probably many more than that, linguistic differences. So you're seeing like several very different linguistic cultures, several very, like, these people all would have practiced like Catholicism in a very culturally unique way, but then you're seeing this as kind of like a common factor across these things. Netherlands does have the bulk by far. For sure. So if you want to go to Netherlands we're the only two guys who are like, oh yeah, we're gonna take a trip to the Netherlands for something weird and sexual, and people are like, oh no. We're like, yeah, we're gonna go to the museum and see medieval badges.
Oh yeah. They're like, okay, these people are sick. Call the cops. And there's also it is also interesting. So that's a great point. So it's kind of spread out. It's not just around the Netherlands. Also important to note that the find locations of these objects does not necessarily reveal their make locations, because by nature they're pilgrimage object. Not all of them are pilgrimage objects, but many of them would be objects that would be sold to people who were away from home for various reasons. And there's reasons why they could be thrown away at the place where you bought them, or lost in your house, or whatever, or lost on the journey along the way. So anyway, but it is also interesting that these are not spread through the Middle Ages, that there's a very strong concentration of them in this 50-year period, or so, towards the end of the 14th century and the beginning of the 15th century. So which is just to say that like the quote, the Middle Ages is not one thing. And that it's also clear we do have some written evidence that, although there is no written evidence directly talking about these genital-shaped badges, there is indirect written evidence of people from this time period being upset about similar types of things. So like people at pilgrimage sites and at church festivals selling like undisclosed like sexual imagery, which may or may not be related to or the same thing that we're talking about. So just to point out that like attitudes to this were varied. So it suggests that some people were just completely cool with this, thought this was amazing. Some people thought that this was pretty freaky deaky and that they were not cool with this, which is exactly what we should expect, because because people are people and no one ever agrees on anything. Yeah, gentle listener, I don't want to ruin your innocence if this episode has not already done that. But like, I'm afraid that one can find kinds of art and popular practices, even in the modern day, upon which even Christians can disagree about its appropriateness. I don't understand.
I mean, there's not one particular holy way of thinking about things that definitely establishes me as a good person no matter what.
If I keep going, I'm going to pass out. It's incredible. No, it's true.
Let the deconstruction process begin.
Yeah, like way back, I think it was in our March Madness.
Fake Saints.
Fake Saints episode last year. We talked about I talked about some parodies, and talked about, I think it was from Saint Nemo, how the people who wrote it thought it was unbelievably hilarious, and a bunch of holy people thought it was unbelievably hilarious, and then this one guy who happened to be a cardinal literally tried to get the Inquisition to destroy this man because he thought it was not funny, Okay, so fine, these I'm gonna say little badges with pilgrim hats that are in fact vulvas are gonna pretty comfortably fit in that category.
Yeah, Catholics, we don't always get along.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about just some different ways that people have tried to interpret these things. Recognizing again that this is a material cultural object, we can put it in the kind of certain cultural context that we know about, religious, cultural, everything else. But ultimately we are kind of left somewhat to our own devices. So a couple of the most common, or I'll just say one of the most common ones that one sees is what you call, there's a fancy art historian word called apotropaic, or apotropaic. The object is an apotropaion, I think, but that's just a fancy word. It's actually an English word, but it just means that it's an object that is supposed to have the power to avert evil influences or bad luck in some fashion or another. So people very frequently have thought that these are sort of in some ways apotropaic images, that they're kind of warding off the evil eye, warding off various kinds of bad luck or bad things. There's a lot of historical precedent for it in Naples. For instance, if you to the present day, if you wander around Naples, there'll be in the older parts of the city, there'll just be you'll see penises around, and in Pompeii.
I was going to bring up Pompeii. Yeah, the little sort of bricks shaped like penises in the ground.
Yeah, in the ground, and then there'll be images.
And a couple decades ago, I like how academia has evolved on this, because a couple decades ago, the predominant assumption was that these were street signs marking where a brothel was, and there was for a long time this sort of very problematic tendency to assume something base whenever anytime kind of genital symbolism was used, including with these medieval badges that we're talking about. But that position has evolved, and people are now really of the general conclusion. It's sort of the collective assumption that like in Pompeii, where these signs are being used, that they were, again, like you're describing, actually to kind of ward off evil, that there was something centrally good inferred in the symbolism of the phallus, and that was a good thing. And then this was used, I found examples of, I think it's pronounced tintinnabula, basically like ancient Roman wind chimes that were using this motif of like a giant phallus with angel wings, that would have been used the same way. So the little bells are tinkling and they're scaring off evil spirits. And then a subject that I actually would like to do a whole kind of episode on when we eventually talk about gargoyles on this show, which is another one of those topics that I have wanted to do with you for a really, really long time. But the Sheila Nagi would be like complete, like from a completely other area. Like we're talking about Italy and a lot of our examples here, but Sheila Nagis are coming out of the Celtic tradition, end up showing up on a lot of Catholic churches, and are essentially like vulvas with arms and legs making scary faces that get carved on the front of churches to scare away demons and stuff. So this motif of both male and female genitalia being used remarkably equally, right, in the ancient world, in fact, and remarkably ubiquitously. It's not just like, oh, the penis has power and the vulva is evil and of sin, or the transverse,
or vice versa.
or the opposite.
Exactly.
Right. But it's actually kind of with a great amount of equality and across a lot of very different cultures, the Celts, the Romans, and then later the Catholics who kind of amalgamate all those things. This is a pretty common positive symbolic language. Rather than, again, this assumption that happened that I think actually kind of birthed a lot of the motifs of the Renaissance Festival that we were joking about at the beginning of this episode, where people just assumed that like medievals had an incredibly bawdy sense of humor and that they were all just wearing these things as a joke. And so when you go to like a Renaissance Festival, you will see that humor kind of emulated. And now academia is able to say, no, like actually they thought this stuff was very holy and very important and not funny at all. Like cute, humorous maybe, but like definitely at its central core, important and valuable and a net positive.
Right. Yeah. So that does get us into like the other kind of, or I would say the other major branch of interpretation of this. And this one's when these objects kind of first began to really be seriously discussed in kind of the 90s mostly. And this was the sort of dominant trend at the beginning, was seeing them as parodic. So that like these are in some ways parodies of religious things. So the clearest one is the phalluses carrying the vulva on the bier that you mentioned with the crown, because it's visually such a direct response to both the physical artifact of watching a procession happen and then like artistic representations of specifically a Marian procession. There's a way in which just the fact that the vulva itself with the crown on the bier has this very, very, very strong sense of a Marian figure in a mandorla, which is so the body halo wearing a crown. And so people thought like, there's a lot to say about that, obviously, but people saw that and they saw, well, this is making fun. This is making fun, and
then they stopped there.
And then they kind of stopped there. So, which is so, okay. So like, again, we're recognizing that like, I'm not trying to fix a signification here. Like, I'm not trying to fix a semiotic meaning, but like, but so like for now, just like laying out the palette of possible meanings. So like this kind of apotropaic that in somehow or another that these are being used to maybe ward off evil influences or demons or spirits or evil eye or whatever you want to call it. Another sort of palette could be that this is that color in the palette is that this is parodic, which can be meant harshly or can be meant gently, to put it sort of badly, which is to say that like that can either be an act of love or it can be an act of hate. And
right, yeah, it can be a good nature taking the piss, or it can be like a sort of renegade screw you middle finger kind of an
and it's going to be really hard to tell apart just looking from the outside. Again, we have textual evidence from a much later period where you're getting more towards sort of like foment around the Reformation. We have textual evidence of people being punished for, parodic fake processions or for those kinds of things, but that's such a later period. I don't think it's really
such a later period. It's a much more like scrupulous and anal retentive period.
It's a whole different thing. So I would say, so just to say like, that's just
different
animal
thing.
Yeah. Another color in our palette would be fertility. There's a really time honored, and again, I'm proposing these things in a kind of I'm not saying whether they're good or bad, right? Because like whatever, you can talk about superstitions and things, but for forever, right? Just forever in any culture. If you go to like any kind of physical artifact part of any museum, basically, if you go to older cultures or cultures with different kinds of technological development and these kinds of things, you're going to see a lot of statues with like big penises, prominent vulvas, these kinds of things, female figures with prominent breasts and prominent vulvas, and these kinds of things that are it's sort of the inverse of the apotropaic kind, where you sort of rub them or touch them or whatever, and you're looking for fertility. There is a theory about these specific objects that like basically, so a lot of them are found in rivers. It just happens that way. Not just our objects. Our objects, by the way, are found mixed with all the others. They're not set aside.
Yeah.
Like they're just, if you find a cache of like pilgrim badges or badges in general, like some of them are going to be,
Well, exactly like now. I mean, if you find somebody's pin collection, there's going to be like a whole bunch of, stuff mixed together.
Yeah, exactly right. And like, so they tend to be found in water, and like some people will make a lot about rivers, some people make a lot about that. Some people will say that's just a red herring, but like, in any case, one theory about this is that you would, if, so of course going on pilgrimage because you want to have a baby is a major pilgrimage motif, is a major motive for like why you go on pilgrimages. If you're a woman who's having a hard time conceiving, or possibly a man who's having a hard time having a baby with his wife, then you're probably going to go on a pilgrimage to try to.
Well, and it's funny. I mean, like, to just look with a kind of empathetic eye towards modern pilgrimage. I mean, this is one of the last real holdouts of that kind of more medieval, and I would say purer spirituality, right? Like my grandparents like took a pilgrimage to a shrine because they were unable to conceive, and they there conceived my father, and like returned to that pilgrimage site every year as a result, kind of made a promise to do so. And then actually my art mentor, one of my primary art mentors in grad school, who was an avowed atheist, when he and his wife couldn't have a child, they took a pilgrimage to a church a Catholic church where you would climb up the stairs on your knees to pray in the top tower, and they conceived their daughter.
Oh my gosh.
He said he still holds like, yeah, there was something about that church. So like this is actually, still a very meaningful, very deeply personal reason to take a pilgrimage that we can't make light of.
No, exactly right. Exactly right. And so like one theory about this is that maybe people would buy 2 of these, and that they would leave one at the site. It's like, this is the idea of when you go to a pilgrimage, there's 2 kinds of objects you get. You an ex voto, which you leave there, and then a blessing object, they're called. You take the blessing with you. So maybe they would buy 2 and leave 1 as an ex voto, and then they would take the blessing with them. Of course, they'd be the same object, just two versions of the same object. So that's a theory.
And then another theory I would say that I came into a few times, or I bumped into a few times, is sort of the negative flip side of the fertility thing, where this is a period where I will cast judgment on this, where tragically castration is a like somewhat ubiquitous punishment for crimes.
Sure. Yeah,
and so you do see, like, for instance, there are secondhand documented cases. I think we talked about this in our relics episode, where, men castrated for like stealing a loaf of bread, Jean Valjean style, end up going to the shrine of Thomas Becket and reporting that their testicles grow back, right? Upon interacting with the sort of vials of his blood that they had for veneration there. Right. So there, the sort of the profound vulnerability of saying there is something amiss or broken about this very intimate, vulnerable part of myself that I'm going to make explicit, that I'm going to make myself vulnerable enough to take this journey and really, really like get into the nuts and bolts of my own spirituality and leave that vulnerability there for God. I mean, I think it's sort of an incredibly provocative.
Hide it. Exactly. Like, I'm not going to hide it.
I'm going to be very ashamed of it. I'm going to put it out there. Yeah. Like, that's a very provocative, very personally meaningful, and I think kind of a universal pain or psychological wound that I think we can all relate to, that would absolutely drive a person to do this, especially if you received then that miracle. You're going to be very excited, as like my grandparents were, as my avowed atheist art teacher was. He would tell everybody about it, right? And like, if you have a pin to show that off in a way that kind of matches your medieval spirituality, your medieval sense of humor simultaneously, like, why not?
Why would you not do this? No, exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, okay, so just like one more color in the palette that we could add into is just commerce. I mean, the place where the places that we know these are being sold, maybe there were other places too, but the places we know these are being sold are at pilgrimage locations and at church festivals. If it's 1378 and you live in Flanders, like this is where people get together. I mean, there are markets and stuff as well. I mean, Flanders is particularly a market town, but anyway, but like basically the biggest groups of people are going to be in especially people that rotate, right? A turnover crowd, where you can sell the same tchotchkes and stuff, are pilgrimage sites and church festivals, right? And so like, that's another one. I mean, these badge makers gotta eat too. And it's possible they were just, like possible the whole association that we have because they're made of the same kind of object as the other, it could also be kind of a red herring or not, or they could all just be part of the same thing. You just like, just go to the badge seller's booth and he's got like a bunch of crucifixions, Mary with the Christ child, like a couple of donkeys for the nativity, and then like some penises, and then like a vulva wearing a hat. And then you're just like, I'll take one of each.
But I guess why, and to come full circle in the conversation, why this is important to me is because all of those reasons, warding off the bad juju, going for, healing of some kind of, extremely vulnerable, wound that I have in regards to my fertility, sheer cynical commerce, all of those things can coexist. But all of those things, even within, I would say, the same pilgrim, right? Like all of those reasons can actually exist within the same pilgrim. I can want to ward off a demon and have my fertility healed and just want a souvenir at the same time, right? Like I can kill that many birds with a single stone.
And I think it's hilarious to wear a dong,
Yeah,
like
right,
maybe I just also
funny.
think
like,
I just think this is hilarious. Which
and
we've talked about this a lot before, but like that never underestimate the fact that like guess what, they were also people and had sense of humor and also thought that like wearing peepees was hilarious.
But to quote you, yeah, that's exactly right. Like that's your catchphrase, but it's true. That's exactly right. Where like why I initially approached you before we even started this podcast and said, eventually I would really like to get to the point where we could have a listenership that could handle a topic like this, is because I think the fact that all those reasons cannot just culturally coexist, but that they in fact can exist within the motives of the same person reveals something really important about the medieval imagination, and reveals something really important about, by extension, what Catholicism and what Catholic art specifically, and again, by extension, Catholic artists should be all about, right? Because there is this perception that is just so blanket and so ubiquitous that, Catholics are super prudish, and therefore the Middle Ages are super prudish, and therefore Catholic art and medieval art is super prudish. And unfortunately, in the modern day, that's more often truer than it isn't, because most Catholics are not actually that Catholic in the way they think about the world. And most Catholic artists are, just out there not trying to create cool things. As we always sign off the episode, they're like very agendaed and trying to like convert people and, make their little propaganda pieces. And I think when you look at something like this, that is so arresting and so jarring to not a modern Christian sensibility, but just a modern sensibility, period, you begin to realize, oh, the medievals and Catholics and Catholic art is actually much more comfortable with not just how we perceive sexuality, but with a very specific, hyper mystical form of sexuality that allows for a self-acceptance that we just cannot possibly relate to as moderns, that allows for a sense of humor, a comfortable camaraderie-based sense of humor that we just are not capable of as moderns. And it sets the standard really high for, a lot of modern cultural values. I mean, we talk about body positivity, right? And how, it's so important to have body positivity now. And like, we stop at maybe you just should hire people who are slightly above the body, like the body weight type of the average model for your underwear ads. And like, we think that is the height of body positivity.
We're doing it. We're really doing it.
I'm here to tell you, the height of body positivity is wearing a pewter penis with a hat on. That's body positivity. We talk about like sex positivity. Same thing. We talk about like, somehow, a lot of like Christian speakers are very, fascinated with trying to get people to understand that, sexuality is good and chastity isn't just this, big cross that everybody's got to carry around being sad all the time. It's like, this is it. This is it. This is what all those things look like. And we're so far, we're operating on such a lower level than that. This is the standard to rise ourselves to. And when you see that boiled down to just, oh, let's tell some naughty jokes in a Renaissance festival, it's such a sad, like inferior funhouse mirror image version of this. And I want my religion and I want my artist friends and I want my experience of art and spirituality to be a hell of a lot more like these little vulva and penis badges that are just walking around having a good old time wearing hats and going on adventures.
Wear the hats that also might have vulvas and penises on them. It gets very complicated.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, right. And it's so tough because in the end, like for instance, because these things are also sort of remarkable in the just like, oh, hey, wow, and like, ooh, historical periods kind of sense, like there are people on Etsy who are selling like reproductions of these things. So you could in fact like buy some if you wanted to.
Yeah, that'd be so crazy if someone had like gotten online last night and ordered several. That would be so crazy if that person did that.
Who would ever do that?
That guy's probably handsome and cool and has a good podcast.
I just think it's amazing. Yeah. And I just think like, I mean, the difficulty, of course, is that like we can't just like automatically bootstrap our way into that, like, because we just are much more alienated from our bodies than that, like we just kind of come to ourselves with a lot more baggage about who I am and what my body is and what other people's bodies are.
The psych terminology would be we are all sort of collectively disassociated from our physical experience.
Yeah, which is just this major aspect of how it is that we live. So like, so I'd say like in thinking about these things, like in the end, like when I first saw them, I was just like, oh, this is just some kind of like dirty medieval thing, whatever. But like you look into it more and you realize like, no, exactly, just as you were saying, Jacob, that this is that there's a richness here that you're sort of like, it's a cool like cultural prism where you're looking at the culture that produces these is going to have whatever problems of its own, but there are a bunch of problems that we have that this culture doesn't have. And some of the problems that we have, it would be great if we didn't, And so thinking about these things, think about like the way of thinking about the body, the way of like thinking about religion, about Christianity, that can be like totally comfortable, allowing all of these different levels to exist simultaneously, like in the same person, the same object, that everything about this person and these things are like brought to Christ to be converted and to be like transformed by his grace, no hiding,
and are brought to your artistic process
and then
to be explored
to
and
your artistic
delved
process
into
and presented to the world in all and I do mean all kinds of different ways, including this one that's going to seem to us like very striking and strange. So I just say like, we often try to present our listeners with like some of the like weirdest prompts or weirdest evidence of ways in which people have responded to like the marvel and beauty of the world, and made weird and beautiful things out of what they have seen, and I just think that like in this episode, we've tried to do this in sort of like the highest possible way, which is take this thing that's like, seems so extremely alienatingly strange, and then let it perform that kind of judo and realize like, oh, I'm actually the one who is alienated, and this thing is not, and the makers of these were not, and just see where it takes you. I'm not saying go out and forge a bunch of penis pins. Although if that's what you do, then that's what you do.
And I'm not saying to necessarily go out and order a bunch of penis and vulva pins. Although if you do that, you're probably a really cool, handsome guy with a cool podcast.
With a cool podcast.
Yeah.
So what I am saying is like, accept the challenge, actually, to like recognize where you are in fact alienated from yourself, even at like the intimate levels of thinking about your own body and like the things that you make that represent bodies, and in every other one kind of way, and like give that to Christ, let him make of it what he's going to do, and go forth and create cool things.
This has been Created Things, a production of Art, Soul, and Mind, hosted by Jacob Flores-Popchak and Father Gabriel Toretta, produced by Kyle Meineke and Jessica Flores-Popchak. Theme song by Federico Carranza. For more on this podcast and the artists featured, follow us on Instagram at Created Things Podcast, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and wherever fine podcasts are streamed.